They told everyone the wedding was a gift from the family, but used my card for every vendor. When I confronted them, my aunt smirked, "You owe us for everything we've done." My cousin added, "It's not like you have a real family anyway." So the night before her big day, I called every vendor, canceled the venue, reserved the catering payment, and froze the DJ's deposit. I, 32M, never thought family could betray you so completely until the night I discovered my credit card had been funding my cousin's entire wedding while she and my aunt told everyone it was their generous gift to the community. The discovery happened by accident. I was reviewing my monthly statements when I noticed several large charges I didn't recognize: a wedding venue deposit, catering payments, DJ services, floral arrangements. My first thought was identity theft. My second thought, after seeing the vendor names, made my blood run cold. These were the exact same vendors my cousin had been bragging about booking for her upcoming wedding. The same venue she'd posted about on social media with captions about how blessed she was to have such a generous family. The same catering company my aunt had been praising at family dinners, talking about how they'd managed to secure such expensive services through their connections and savings. I sat in my kitchen at 2 a.m, credit card statements spread across the table like evidence at a crime scene. Every charge told the same story: my money, their lies, her dream wedding built on my financial foundation without my knowledge or consent. My hands shook as I called the credit card company's fraud line. The representative confirmed what I already suspected. Someone had been using my card information for months, making purchases totaling nearly $40,000. The charges had been strategically spaced out, small enough individually to avoid triggering automatic fraud alerts, but devastating when combined. The next morning, I drove to my aunt's house with printouts of every fraudulent charge. My aunt answered the door with her usual warm smile, the same expression she'd worn at countless family gatherings where she'd praised her daughter's wedding planning skills and their family's ability to create such a beautiful celebration. When I confronted her about the charges, her smile didn't waver. Instead, she invited me inside and offered coffee as if we were discussing the weather. I declined and spread the statements across her dining room table, pointing out each vendor charge with increasing fury. My aunt examined the papers with theatrical concern, nodding sympathetically as I explained how I discovered the fraud. She listened patiently, making appropriate sounds of shock and dismay. Then she looked up at me with that same warm smile and delivered the most chilling response I'd ever heard from a family member. She told me I should consider this my contribution to the family. She reminded me of all the times they'd helped me over the years: the childhood birthday parties, the holiday dinners, the rides to school when my parents were working. She calculated these past kindnesses like a debt collector, presenting a bill 20 years in the making. My cousin emerged from upstairs during this conversation, wedding dress hanging in a garment bag over her arm. She'd been listening from the stairwell and joined her mother's defense without missing a beat. She told me the wedding was bringing joy to the entire extended family, creating memories that would last forever. She suggested I should be honored to play such an important role in making those memories possible. When I demanded they repay the money immediately, my aunt's expression finally changed. The warm smile vanished, replaced by cold calculation. She told me I owed them for everything they'd done for me over the years. She listed every favor, every meal, every moment of childhood care as if they were investments requiring interest. My cousin stepped closer, her voice dropping to a whisper that somehow felt more threatening than shouting. She told me it wasn't like I had a real family anyway. She reminded me that my parents had died in a car accident when I was 15, leaving me essentially orphaned until my aunt's family took me in. She suggested that without them, I would have had nothing and no one. The cruelty of that statement hit me like a physical blow. These people had taken me in after the worst tragedy of my life, helped me through high school and college, and now they were using that generosity as justification for stealing from me. Worse, they were weaponizing my grief and gratitude to silence my objections to their theft. I left their house that afternoon with nothing resolved. My aunt had promised to look into the charges, claiming there must be some mistake. My cousin had returned to wedding preparations, acting as if our conversation had never happened. They both seemed confident that family loyalty would prevent me from taking any real action against them. That evening, I sat in my apartment and thought about everything they'd said. They were right about one thing. They had helped me after my parents died. but they were wrong about everything else. The kindness they'd shown me as a grieving teenager didn't entitle them to steal from me as an adult. The love my parents had given me before their death was real family, not something these people could erase or replace. I spent the next week researching my options. I learned about credit card fraud procedures, civil litigation possibilities, and criminal charges for identity theft. I also learned something more immediately useful. Most wedding vendors require final payments and confirmations within 24 to 48 hours of the event. My cousin's wedding was scheduled for Saturday afternoon. On Friday morning, I received a call from my credit card company confirming that they would be reversing all fraudulent charges and issuing me a new card. The vendors would be notified that the original payment method was no longer valid. I waited until Friday evening to make my calls. The venue manager seemed genuinely surprised to learn that the card holder hadn't authorized the charges. They explained their policy. Without valid payment, the venue couldn't be held for the event. They offered to work with my cousin directly if she could provide alternative payment, but given the short notice and the size of the balance, they seemed doubtful. The caterer was more understanding, but equally firm. They'd already purchased ingredients for the reception dinner, but without payment confirmation, they couldn't proceed with preparation or delivery. They suggested my cousin contact them immediately to resolve the payment issue. The DJ was the most frustrated of all the vendors. He'd already loaded his equipment and cleared his schedule for Saturday. He asked several times if I was certain about canceling, warning me about the disruption this would cause. I confirmed that the charges were fraudulent and that I'd never authorized any wedding-related expenses. Each conversation felt like dropping a stone into a still pond, watching ripples spread outward toward an inevitable collision. I knew exactly what would happen Saturday morning when my cousin and her fiancé arrived at vendors who were no longer expecting them. Saturday morning arrived gray and overcast, matching my mood as I waited for the calls I knew would come. My phone started ringing at 8:30, just as venues typically open their doors for event setup. My cousin called first, her voice shrill with panic. She demanded to know what I'd done, why the venue was claiming they had no record of confirmed payment. She insisted this was all a misunderstanding, that I needed to call them immediately and straighten everything out. My aunt called 20 minutes later, her tone shifting between fury and desperation. She told me I was destroying the most important day of my cousin's life over money that meant nothing to someone in my financial position. She reminded me again of their generosity after my parents' death, suggesting that ruining this wedding would make me no better than an ungrateful child. The groom's mother called an hour later, a woman I'd never met who somehow had my phone number. She explained that their family had guests traveling from 3 states away, that hotel rooms had been booked and time off work had been requested. She asked what it would take to resolve this situation quickly. I let all the calls go to voicemail. Each message grew more desperate, more angry, more willing to say cruel things about my character and my ingratitude. But none of them offered to repay the stolen money. None of them acknowledged that using someone's credit card without permission was theft. They all focused on the inconvenience I was causing rather than the crime they had committed. By noon, the messages had shifted to threats. My aunt left a voicemail promising that I would be banned from all family events going forward. My cousin sent text messages calling me names I won't repeat, suggesting that my parents would be ashamed of the person I'd become. Extended family members I barely knew left messages taking sides without understanding the full situation. The irony wasn't lost on me. They were cutting me off from a family that had apparently never valued me anyway, threatening to withdraw love that had always come with conditions and expectations. Update 1. Sunday morning brought a different kind of message. My cousin called, her voice smaller and more defeated than I'd ever heard it. She explained that they'd managed to salvage part of the wedding by finding an alternative venue at the last minute, a community center that cost a fraction of the original location. They'd ordered pizza instead of the planned dinner, and her fiancé's brother had volunteered to DJ using his laptop and portable speakers. She told me the day had still been beautiful, that being married was more important than having a perfect wedding. She said she'd learned something about what really mattered in life. For a moment, I thought she might apologize, might acknowledge what she and her mother had done. Instead, she asked if I would consider this lesson punishment enough. She suggested that the embarrassment and stress of the last-minute changes had taught her about the importance of honesty in family relationships. She wondered if we could move forward without involving lawyers or criminal charges. I listened to this message 3 times, trying to understand the logic. She seemed to believe that experiencing consequences for theft was the same as facing justice for theft. She thought that learning a lesson about honesty was equivalent to making amends for dishonesty. My aunt left a message that same afternoon, her tone more calculated than her daughter's. She suggested that family problems should stay within the family, that involving outside authorities would hurt everyone involved. She proposed a payment plan for the money they'd stolen, spread out over several years with no interest, as if they were doing me a favor by agreeing to eventually repay their debt. She also mentioned that she'd been talking to other family members about the situation. She'd presented their version of events, where I had initially agreed to help with wedding costs, but then changed my mind at the last minute out of spite. She'd painted me as someone who had promised financial support and then withdrawn it maliciously. This revision of history was masterful in its simplicity. It maintained their reputation within the extended family while making me the villain of their story. Anyone who only heard their side would naturally sympathize with a bride whose family member had sabotaged her wedding over a misunderstanding about money. Update 2. Monday brought the first consequences I hadn't anticipated. My boss asked to speak with me privately, explaining that someone had called the office claiming to be my aunt. She told him I was having a family emergency that might affect my work performance, suggesting he should be understanding if I seemed distracted or unreliable. The manipulation was sophisticated. She'd positioned herself as a concerned family member looking out for my professional interests while simultaneously planting seeds of doubt about my stability. If my work performance had actually suffered, her call would have provided context. If it hadn't, she'd still managed to make my employer question my personal life. I explained the real situation to my boss, who was appropriately appalled. He assured me that family members shouldn't be calling employees' workplaces without permission and that he appreciated me clarifying the circumstances. But the damage was subtle and hard to measure. How do you undo someone's first impression once it's been planted? That afternoon, I received a call from my credit card company with an update on their investigation. They'd completed their initial review and confirmed that the charges were indeed fraudulent. The vendors had been cooperative in providing documentation, and the evidence clearly showed that someone else had been using my card information without authorization. The representative explained my options for pursuing criminal charges. Identity theft and credit card fraud were serious crimes with significant penalties. However, they also warned me that prosecuting family members often complicated cases, especially when the defendants could claim there had been some kind of understanding or agreement. I scheduled a consultation with a lawyer for Wednesday, wanting to understand both my legal options and the practical challenges of pursuing justice against family members who were actively working to undermine my credibility. Update 3. The lawyer's office was in a downtown building that smelled like coffee and old paper. The attorney, a woman in her 50s who specialized in financial fraud cases, listened to my story with the kind of professional detachment that made me realize how bizarre my situation really was. She explained that I had a strong case for civil recovery of the stolen money, along with potential criminal charges for identity theft and fraud. The documentation was clear, the amounts were significant, and the vendors could testify that they'd never dealt directly with me regarding the wedding services. However, she also outlined the challenges I would face. Family fraud cases often became character battles, where the defendant's attorneys would focus on the relationship history rather than the criminal acts. My aunt and cousin would likely claim there had been some understanding or agreement about my financial support, making it a matter of family dispute rather than theft. She asked about my long-term goals for the case. Did I want full financial recovery, criminal prosecution, or both? Was I prepared for the possibility that pursuing justice might permanently destroy relationships with extended family members who didn't know the full truth? I thought about her questions for several days. The money mattered, but it wasn't enough to bankrupt me. The principle mattered more. The idea that family relationships couldn't be used to justify theft, that gratitude for past kindness didn't create unlimited future obligations. But what mattered most was the pattern I could see forming. If I let this go, if I accepted their promises to eventually repay the money they'd stolen, I would be teaching them that family loyalty meant accepting abuse and manipulation. I would be confirming their belief that my grief and gratitude made me vulnerable to exploitation. My parents had taught me to value family, but they'd also taught me to stand up for myself. They'd shown me what healthy family relationships looked like, based on love and respect, not obligation and manipulation. Honoring their memory meant refusing to accept the toxic substitute my aunt's family was offering. I decided to pursue both civil and criminal charges. Not because I wanted revenge, but because I wanted justice. Not because I hated my aunt and cousin, but because I refused to let them redefine family love as something that required victims and sacrifices. The night before I filed the first legal papers, my aunt called one more time. Her tone had shifted again, becoming almost philosophical as she reflected on our family history. She told me about the burden she'd carried after taking me in, the sacrifices she'd made to raise someone else's child. She suggested that children owed their guardians more than just gratitude. They owed them consideration for all the costs and complications of unexpected parenthood. She painted a picture of my teenage years that I barely recognized, where I'd been a difficult and expensive burden rather than a grieving child who needed support. She calculated the cost of my room and board, my school supplies and activities, my college application fees and graduation expenses. She presented these costs as investments that had never been repaid. Finally, she made her real offer. She would agree to repay half the money they'd stolen if I would agree to consider the other half payment for my childhood expenses. She would acknowledge that using my credit card without permission had been wrong if I would acknowledge that I owed them for raising me after my parents died. I listened to this proposal with a clarity I'd never felt before. My aunt wasn't offering justice or making amends. She was trying to negotiate a deal where theft became partial repayment of a debt I'd never agreed to owe. She was asking me to retroactively consent to being robbed by agreeing that I'd been financially obligated to them all along. The next morning, I walked into the courthouse with my lawyer and filed charges against both my aunt and cousin for identity theft, credit card fraud, and conspiracy to commit financial crimes. The paperwork was surprisingly simple, just forms and signatures that reduced months of family manipulation to clear legal categories. As we left the building, my lawyer asked if I felt good about the decision. I thought about her question as we walked to our cars in the morning sunshine. I didn't feel good exactly, but I felt right. I felt like someone who had stopped being a victim and started being a person who expected to be treated with basic respect. My phone buzzed with a text message from my cousin as I drove home. She'd heard about the charges and wanted me to know that I was making the biggest mistake of my life. She promised that no one in the family would ever forgive me for choosing lawyers over love, courts over compassion. I read her message at the next red light and realized she still didn't understand what had really happened. She thought I was punishing her for using my money. She couldn't see that I was simply refusing to be stolen from anymore. The difference might seem subtle, but it felt enormous. For the first time since discovering the fraudulent charges, I wasn't angry or hurt or confused. I was just someone who had been robbed, who had reported the crime, and who was letting the system work exactly as it was designed to work. That afternoon, I drove to the cemetery where my parents were buried. I hadn't visited in months, but something about the morning's legal filing made me want to see them. Their headstones looked smaller than I remembered, weathered by 15 years of seasons I'd experienced without them. I told them about what had happened, speaking out loud in the empty cemetery about family and theft and the difference between love and manipulation. I explained my decision to press charges, my choice to treat my aunt and cousin like strangers who had committed crimes rather than family members who had made mistakes. As I talked, I realized something that had been building in my mind for weeks. My parents had been my real family. People who had loved me without conditions, who had never calculated the cost of that love or presented bills for their kindness. The people who had raised me after their death had provided care, but they had never provided family in the truest sense. Family doesn't steal from you and then blame you for being upset about the theft. Family doesn't use your grief as leverage for future compliance. Family doesn't calculate the cost of love and present invoices for past kindness. Real family, the kind my parents had given me, is about protection and support flowing freely in all directions. It's about people who want the best for each other without keeping score, who solve problems together instead of creating them for each other. As I drove home from the cemetery, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years, excited about the future. Not because I was getting revenge on people who had hurt me, but because I was finally free from people who had been hurting me for longer than I'd realized. The criminal charges would take months to resolve. The civil case might take even longer. But the real resolution had happened that morning when I'd stopped being someone who could be stolen from and started being someone who expected basic honesty from the people in his life. My aunt and cousin had taught me an important lesson, though not the one they'd intended. They'd shown me the difference between family obligation and family love, between guilt and gratitude, between being used and being valued. For that education, painful as it had been, I was genuinely grateful. Just not grateful enough to let them keep my money.